The morning sun filtered through the windows of Sakura Elementary School in Yokohama, casting long shadows across the busy hallways. It was mid-October, and the entire school buzzed with an energy that only came once a year. The autumn festival was just 2 weeks away, and every classroom had transformed into a workshop of creativity and chaos. In room 3B, students huddled in small groups, their voices overlapping as they planned their performances. Some practiced traditional dances, their arms moving in synchronized patterns they'd learned from their grandparents. Others rehearsed short comedy skits, breaking into giggles every few minutes. The art students covered their hands in paint, working on large banners that would decorate the school grounds. Teachers moved between groups, offering suggestions and making sure nobody got too carried away with their ideas. But in the back corner of the classroom, near the window overlooking the small garden, sat a boy who seemed untouched by all the excitement. Kenji Tanaka was 8 years old, with dark hair that fell just above his eyes and a way of sitting that made him almost disappear into his surroundings. While his classmates chattered and laughed, he traced patterns on his desk with his finger, creating invisible designs only he could see. This wasn't unusual for Kenji. He had always been the quiet one. During lunch, while other kids traded snacks and talked about their favorite cartoon shows, he would eat alone, watching the clouds drift past the window. At recess, the playground filled with shouts and laughter as children played tag or kicked soccer balls. But Kenji preferred to sit under the old cherry tree, sometimes with a book, sometimes just thinking his own thoughts. His teachers described him as polite but distant, a student who completed his work without fuss but never raised his hand to answer questions. The other children didn't bully him exactly. They simply didn't notice him much. He was like a piece of furniture that had always been there, familiar but unremarkable. Some of the kinder students would occasionally invite him to join their games, but Kenji would shake his head with a small smile. And eventually, they stopped asking. It wasn't that he was unfriendly. He just seemed to exist in his own world, separated from everyone else by an invisible wall. As the festival preparations continued, Kenji found himself thinking about music. He often did, though nobody knew this about him. There was something about the way notes came together, the way a melody could express feelings that words never could, that fascinated him deeply. He would listen to the classical music that played in the shopping district near his home, standing still on the sidewalk while other people rushed past. Sometimes he'd close his eyes and let the sound wash over him, his fingers twitching slightly as if trying to capture the music in the air. The school had 2 pianos. Everyone knew about the beautiful new grand piano that sat in the main hall, its black surface so polished you could see your reflection in it. The music teacher, Mrs. Yamamoto, kept it covered with a special cloth and only the advanced students were allowed to touch it. It was the pride of the school, purchased after years of fundraising and parent donations. But there was another piano, one that most people had forgotten about. It lived in the old music room at the end of the second-floor corridor, a room that smelled of dust and old paper. This piano was an upright model, probably 40 or 50 years old, with wood that had faded from rich brown to a dull gray. Several of its keys had turned yellow with age and some were chipped at the edges. But the real problem wasn't how it looked. The real problem was that it barely worked anymore. Half the keys stuck when you pressed them, requiring you to wiggle them free before they would pop back up. Others made sounds so quiet you could barely hear them even in a silent room. The tuning had gone wrong years ago, giving certain notes a strange off-key quality that made any song sound slightly wrong. The school had meant to fix it or throw it away, but somehow it just kept sitting there, gathering dust in the corner while everyone used the beautiful new piano instead. One afternoon, about 2 weeks before the festival, a group of 6th grade boys were wandering the hallways during their free period. They were the kind of kids who always seemed to be looking for entertainment, usually at someone else's expense. Their unofficial leader was a tall boy named Hiroshi, who had a sharp smile and a talent for finding other people's weak spots. As they passed by room 3B, Hiroshi glanced through the door window and spotted Kenji sitting alone as usual. An idea formed in his mind, the kind of idea that made his friends lean in closer when he whispered it to them. They all started grinning, nodding at each other with the shared understanding of a plan taking shape. The group walked into the 3rd grade classroom with exaggerated friendliness. Most of the students barely looked up, too focused on their festival preparations. But Kenji noticed them approaching and something in his stomach tightened with an old familiar feeling. He'd learned over the years that when older students paid attention to quiet kids like him, it rarely meant anything good. "Hey there," Hiroshi said, his voice dripping with false warmth. "We heard you haven't signed up for any festival performances yet. That's too bad. Everyone should participate, don't you think?" Kenji looked up at him but didn't speak. His hands, which had been tracing invisible patterns on his desk, went still. "You know what would be really cool?" One of Hiroshi's friends chimed in. "A piano performance. The festival could use more music." "Oh, but all the good students already signed up to use the grand piano," another boy added, barely suppressing a smirk. "That list is completely full." Hiroshi leaned against Kenji's desk, his smile widening. "But you know what? There's another piano nobody's using. That old one in the music room. You could play that one. What do you say? Want to give everyone a special performance?" The other sixth graders struggled to keep straight faces. They all knew about that broken piano. They'd tried playing it themselves once as a joke, banging on the stuck keys and laughing at the awful sounds it made. The idea of quiet, awkward Kenji trying to perform on it in front of the whole school was too perfect. They could already imagine the embarrassment, the laughter from the crowd, the look on his face when he realized he'd been set up. Kenji stared at them for a long moment. He understood what was happening, could see the cruel amusement dancing in their eyes. A smarter response would have been to refuse, to shake his head and return to his silent world where nobody bothered him. But something unexpected happened in that moment. Instead of fear or anger, Kenji felt something else stirring inside him. It was a feeling he couldn't quite name, something that had been sleeping for a long time and was now slowly opening its eyes. He thought about all those afternoons standing outside the music store, watching the pianos through the window. He thought about the melodies that lived in his head, the ones he'd never had a chance to share with anyone. "Okay," he said quietly. "I'll do it." The sixth graders blinked, surprised by how easy this had been. They'd expected more resistance, maybe some questions. But Kenji just sat there looking at them with those calm, dark eyes as if he'd just agreed to something perfectly ordinary. "Great," Hiroshi said, recovering quickly. "We'll make sure the teachers know. This is going to be amazing." As the older boys left, already whispering and laughing among themselves about what they'd just set in motion, Kenji turned back to the window. His reflection stared back at him in the glass, and for the first time in a long while, he saw something different in his own face. Not confidence exactly, but a quiet determination that surprised even him. The other students in his class had noticed the exchange, and word began to spread quickly. The quiet boy who never did anything was going to play piano at the festival. On the broken piano. This was going to be interesting, they whispered to each other. Some felt a twinge of sympathy, wondering if they should warn him, but most were simply curious about what would happen. Kenji gathered his things as the final bell rang. As he walked down the hallway toward home, he made a small detour to the old music room. He pushed open the door and stood in the doorway, looking at the forgotten piano in the corner. Dust particles danced in the afternoon light that slanted through the windows. He walked over to it slowly and sat down on the creaky bench. His fingers hovered over the keys for a moment before gently pressing down on middle C. The key stuck halfway, producing a muffled, sad little sound before reluctantly returning to its starting position. Kenji smiled slightly. It wasn't much, but it was a start. He had 2 weeks. The Tanaka family lived in a small apartment above their ramen shop, just a 5-minute walk from the train station. The location was perfect for business, with commuters stopping by for a quick bowl before catching their trains. But it meant the family's home always carried the warm, heavy smell of broth and noodles. Not that anyone minded. It was the smell of hard work and survival. Kenji's father, Takeshi, woke up every morning at 4 to prepare the broth, simmering pork bones and vegetables for hours until the flavor was just right. His mother, Yuki, handled everything else, from chopping green onions to serving customers with a smile even when her feet ached from standing all day. They were good people, the kind who remembered regular customers' preferences and always gave a little extra to the elderly folks who came in alone. But running a small ramen shop in a city like Yokohama meant there was never quite enough money left over after paying rent and buying ingredients. They got by, as Takeshi often said, and that was more than many could claim. Still, there were luxuries they simply couldn't afford. New clothes came once a year, if that. Vacations were something they saw other families take, And things like music lessons, art classes, or sports teams were completely out of the question. Kenji had never asked for much. Even as a small child, he seemed to understand without being told that every yen had to be carefully considered. He wore his school uniform until it was too small, never complained about eating the same meals day after day, and found his entertainment in free things like library books and watching the world go by. What his parents didn't know, what he'd never found the words to tell them, was that music had become the most important thing in his life. It had started almost by accident 3 years earlier, when he discovered the music section at the local library. The building was old and quiet, and the librarian, an elderly woman with kind eyes, never minded when Kenji spent entire afternoons there. He'd checked out books about composers, studied pictures of different instruments, and read about musical theory even when he didn't fully understand it. But books could only teach so much. What really educated him was listening. The shopping district near their apartment played classical music through outdoor speakers, probably to create a pleasant atmosphere for shoppers. Most people barely noticed it, just background noise while they rushed from store to store. But Kenji noticed everything. He learned to identify pieces by their opening notes. He could hear the difference between Mozart and Beethoven, between a piano concerto and a symphony. He would stand outside the music store, watching through the window as the teacher inside gave lessons to students whose parents could afford them. His eyes would track the students' fingers on the keys, memorizing the patterns, the way their hands moved. Sometimes the store owner, thinking Kenji was just a curious kid, would wave at him to come inside. But Kenji always shook his head and walked away, embarrassed. He couldn't explain that watching was enough, that in his mind he was playing along with those students, feeling the keys beneath his own fingers even though he'd never actually touched a piano that worked properly. When Kenji came home that evening after agreeing to perform at the festival, his mother was in the middle of the dinner rush. The small shop was full of customers, and she moved between tables with practiced efficiency, taking orders and delivering steaming bowls of ramen. Kenji slipped upstairs to their apartment and started on his homework, waiting for the quiet that usually came around 8 o'clock. Later, when the last customer had left and his father was cleaning the kitchen, the family sat down together for their own meal. This was their time, the only part of the day when they could just be a family instead of shop owners and helpers. "How was school?" his mother asked, serving him a bowl of ramen with extra pork, the way she always did when she thought he looked tired. Kenji ate a few bites before speaking. "The autumn festival is in 2 weeks. "Oh, that's right," Yuki said, smiling. "I remember you mentioning it. Will there be food stalls? Maybe we should visit." "I'm going to perform," Kenji said quietly. Both parents looked up from their food. His father set down his chopsticks and his mother's smile froze in place, becoming something uncertain. "Perform?" Takeshi asked carefully. "Perform what?" "Piano," Kenji said, not meeting their eyes. "I'm going to play piano." The silence that followed was heavy with confusion and worry. Yuki glanced at her husband, searching for the right words. They'd never seen their son play an instrument. They didn't own a piano, had never had money for lessons. Where had this come from? "Kenji," his mother said gently, "that's wonderful that you want to try, but have you ever played piano before?" "Not a real one," he admitted. "Not one that works." Takeshi leaned forward, his weathered hands clasped together. He was a man of few words, but when he spoke, it was always with careful thought. "Son, performing in front of people is difficult. It takes practice and skill. I don't want to discourage you, but I'm worried you might be setting yourself up for disappointment." Kenji finally looked up at them. In his eyes was something they'd never quite seen before, a quiet intensity that surprised them both. "I know it might not go well," he said, "but I want to try anyway." Yuki felt her heart squeeze in her chest. She knew the other children didn't include Kenji much, knew he spent his recesses alone. She'd worried about it for years, wondered if they should encourage him more to make friends, to be more outgoing. But he'd always seemed content in his solitude, and they'd told themselves that some children were just naturally quiet. Now looking at her son's determined face, she wondered if maybe he'd been lonely all along and just never said anything. Maybe this performance, however it turned out, was his way of trying to connect with the world beyond his own thoughts. "The piano at school," Kenji continued, his voice steady. "It's old and some keys don't work right, but I'd like to practice with it. Would it be okay if I stayed after school for the next 2 weeks?" Takeshi and Yuki exchanged glances. Their son had never asked to stay late at school before. He always came straight home, did his homework in the apartment, and helped out in the shop when needed. This was completely unlike him. Every day? His mother asked. Kenji nodded. I'll come home before it gets dark. I promise. His father was quiet for a long moment, studying his son's face. He thought about his own childhood, about dreams he'd had that never came true because life got in the way. He thought about how hard he and Yuki worked just to keep the shop running, how they couldn't give Kenji the opportunities other children had. Maybe this was something small they could give him, even if it was just permission to try. All right, Takeshi said finally. You can stay and practice, but you need to be careful walking home, and if you're going to be later than usual, you call the shop. Understood? Yes, father. Yuki reached across the table and squeezed Kenji's hand. Will you tell us about it? About what you're going to play? Kenji thought about this. I don't know yet, he said honestly. I need to learn what the piano can do first. Every piano is different. His parents didn't fully understand what he meant, but they nodded anyway. After dinner, Kenji helped wash the dishes as always, but his mind was clearly elsewhere. Yuki watched him dry each bowl with careful attention, his movements methodical and precise, and she wondered where this determination had come from. That night, unable to sleep, she went to her son's room. The door was slightly open and she could see him sitting at his small desk, his fingers moving across the surface as if playing invisible keys. He was completely absorbed, his eyes closed, his head swaying slightly. She realized with a start that he was hearing music in his head, music she couldn't hear. She didn't disturb him. Instead, she went back to her own room where Takeshi was already snoring softly. She lay awake in the darkness, worry gnawing at her. What if the other children laughed at him? What if he failed in front of everyone and it broke something inside him that couldn't be fixed? Their quiet, gentle son had finally found something he wanted to do, and she was terrified it would only bring him pain. But there was also a small part of her, a part she barely acknowledged, that felt a flutter of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they were about to discover something about their son that had been hidden all along. Maybe those hours he spent lost in thought, those afternoons he claimed to be at the library, had all been leading to this moment. The next morning, Kenji left for school earlier than usual. He had that same quiet determination in his eyes, and when he said goodbye, Yuki hugged him a little tighter than normal. Good luck with your practice, she whispered. Thank you, Mom, as she watched him walk down the street, his small figure disappearing into the crowd of students heading to school. She said a silent prayer to whoever might be listening. Not that he would be perfect, not that he would impress everyone, just that whatever happened at that festival, her son would be okay. Downstairs, the morning prep work was waiting. Takeshi was already boiling water for the broth, steam rising in thick clouds in the kitchen. Yuki tied on her apron and got to work, but part of her mind stayed with her son, wondering what was happening in that dusty music room. She didn't know that Kenji was already there, sitting at the broken piano, carefully testing each key, learning its personality. She didn't know about the older boys who'd set him up as a joke. Didn't know that most of the school was already whispering about the quiet kid who was going to make a fool of himself. All she knew was that her son had finally asked for something, and she and Takeshi had said yes. Whatever came next, they would face it together as a family. In the ramen shop, steam continued to rise from the pots. Customers began to arrive for breakfast, and life went on as it always did. But something had shifted, something small but significant. Kenji Tanaka, the quiet boy who never asked for anything, had decided to step into the light, and his parents, despite their fears, were going to let him. The old music room at the end of the second-floor corridor had a particular kind of quiet that Kenji had never experienced anywhere else. It wasn't the silence of an empty space, but rather a waiting kind of quiet, as if the room itself was holding its breath. Dust particles floated lazily in the afternoon sunlight that streamed through the tall windows, and the air smelled of old wood and forgotten things. Every day after his classmates left, after the hallways emptied and the school settled into its after-hours stillness, Kenji would make his way to this room. He'd slide open the door carefully, as if not wanting to disturb something sacred, and there it would be waiting for him. The broken piano. On the first day, he simply sat on the bench for 10 minutes without playing a single note. He looked at the keys, studied the scratches on the wood, noticed how some keys sat slightly lower than others. He pressed each one slowly, listening not just to the sound it made but to how it felt under his fingers. Some keys resisted, requiring firm pressure before they would go down. Others were loose and wobbly. A few in the middle range barely made any sound at all, producing only a whisper of a note. Most people would have given up immediately. The piano was clearly broken beyond simple repair, but Kenji didn't see it that way. To him, each imperfection was like a word in a language he was learning to speak. The sticky key in the upper register that took 2 seconds to pop back up, that was a pause, a breath in the music. The 3 keys in the middle that produced almost no sound, those were opportunities for silence, for letting other notes shine. He pulled out a small notebook from his backpack, the kind with plain pages that his mother had bought him for school notes. On the first page, he drew a simple diagram of the keyboard and began marking which keys worked and which didn't. He color-coded them: green for keys that worked normally, yellow for keys that stuck or were delayed, red for keys that barely made sound, and black for 2 keys that produced no sound at all. By the end of the first week, his notebook was filled with observations. He'd written things like E-flat sticks for 1.5 seconds and G above middle C sounds best when played softly, and avoid quick combinations with D and F together. To anyone else, it would have looked like the notes of a scientist studying some complex experiment. In a way, that's exactly what it was. The school janitor, Mr. Ito, first noticed Kenji on the 3rd day of practice. Mr. Ito was 72 years old and had worked at Sakura Elementary for more than 30 years. He'd seen thousands of children pass through these halls, had cleaned up after countless school events and festivals. He'd mopped floors and fixed broken desks and knew every corner of the building better than anyone. He'd also been a piano player once, back when he was young and the world seemed full of possibilities. Life had taken him in different directions, but he still remembered what it felt like to sit at a piano and lose himself in music. So when he heard the halting, strange sounds coming from the old music room, he was curious. Mr. Ito would finish his cleaning duties in the classrooms nearby, then quietly approach the music room door. There was a small window in the door, and through it, he could see the small boy sitting at the broken piano, completely absorbed in what he was doing. At first, Mr. Ito assumed the child was just playing around, killing time before going home. But as the days passed, he began to realize something else was happening. The boy wasn't just randomly pressing keys. He was studying the instrument with an intensity Mr. Ito had rarely seen in someone so young. He watched as Kenji would play the same combination of notes over and over, sometimes stopping to write something in his notebook, then trying again with a slight variation. It reminded Mr. Ito of how master craftsmen worked, carefully learning the character of their tools before attempting to create something. One evening, about a week into Kenji's practice sessions, Mr. Ito couldn't contain his curiosity any longer. He knocked gently on the door before sliding it open. Kenji looked up, startled. His hands froze above the keys, and for a moment he looked like a child caught doing something wrong. "I'm sorry," Mr. Ito said with a warm smile. "I didn't mean to scare you. I've just been hearing you practice, and I wanted to check if everything was all right." "I have permission to stay," Kenji said quickly. "My parents said it's okay." "Oh, I'm sure you do. I'm not worried about that." Mr. Ito stepped into the room, his old knees creaking slightly. "I'm just curious about what you're working on. That's quite a challenging instrument you've chosen." Kenji looked down at the keys. "It's the only one available." "Ah," Mr. Ito said, understanding immediately. He'd heard the older boys talking and laughing in the hallways about the quiet kid who was going to embarrass himself at the festival. He'd wanted to say something to them, but it wasn't his place to interfere with student matters. Now, seeing Kenji's serious expression, he felt a pang of sympathy. "May I?" Mr. Ito gestured to the bench. Kenji scooted over, making room. The old janitor sat down with a sigh and placed his weathered hands on the keys. He played a simple scale, and the piano responded with its collection of proper notes, stuck keys, and silences. "Terrible, isn't it?" Mr. Ito said with a slight laugh. "We really should have thrown this old thing out years ago." "I don't think it's terrible," Kenji said quietly. "It's just different." Mr. Ito turned to look at the boy, surprised. "Different how?" Kenji thought for a moment, trying to find the right words. "My father always says that every bowl of ramen he makes is a little different, even when he follows the same recipe. The broth might be slightly thicker one day, or the noodles might cook a bit longer. But that doesn't make it bad. It just makes it unique. Your father is a wise man, Mr. Ito said softly. So you're treating this piano like your father treats his ramen? Kenji nodded. I'm trying to learn what it wants to be instead of forcing it to be something it's not. Mr. Ito felt something catch in his throat. He'd been cleaning schools for 3 decades, had countless brief interactions with students, but this quiet boy had just said something profound without even realizing it. Would you play something for me? He asked. I'm not very good yet, Kenji warned. I don't mind. Kenji placed his hands on the keys and began to play. It was a simple melody, one he'd learned by listening to the music in the shopping district. But the way he played it was unlike anything Mr. Ito had heard before. When he reached a key that stuck, he didn't fight it. Instead, he let the pause become part of the rhythm. When he came to the keys that made almost no sound, he played them anyway, and somehow their near silence created a ghostly effect that added depth to the melody. It wasn't perfect. Far from it. There were hesitations and awkward moments, but there was also something genuine in it, something that spoke of hours of careful thought and practice. Mr. Ito realized that this boy wasn't trying to play despite the piano's flaws. He was playing with them, incorporating them into the music itself. When Kenji finished, Mr. Ito sat in silence for a moment. How long have you been playing piano? He finally asked. I've never had lessons, Kenji admitted. I just listen to music and try to remember how it sounds. Then I imagine what my fingers would do to make those sounds. You taught yourself? Kenji nodded, looking embarrassed. Is that wrong? Wrong, no, child. It's remarkable. Mr. Ito stood up slowly, his hand resting briefly on Kenji's shoulder. Keep practicing. I think you're onto something special here. After that evening, Mr. Ito made a habit of checking on Kenji every day. Sometimes he would just watch through the door window, not wanting to disturb the boy's concentration. Other times he would come in and sit in an old chair in the corner, listening as Kenji worked through his practice. He watched as Kenji's approach evolved. The boy had started by trying to play simple melodies, but as he grew more comfortable with the piano's quirks, he became more ambitious. He began attempting pieces that Mr. Ito recognized as classical works, though Kenji played them in fragments, adapting them to work within the constraints of the broken instrument. What amazed Mr. Ito most was the boy's patience. Kenji would spend 20 minutes on a single phrase, playing it over and over with slight variations until he found a version that worked. He never showed frustration when a key stuck or failed to produce sound. Instead, he would pause, think, make a note in his notebook, and try a different approach. Mr. Ito saw something in those practice sessions that he'd seen in very few people: true dedication. Not the kind of dedication that came from a teacher's expectations or a parent's pressure, but the kind that came from deep within, from a genuine love of something. As the second week began, Kenji's playing started to transform. The hesitations became less frequent. His fingers moved with more confidence across the keys. He'd learned to anticipate which keys would stick and had developed a technique to work with them rather than against them. The silent keys became intentional rests in the music, moments of breath that actually enhanced the overall sound. One afternoon, with only 3 days left before the festival, Mr. Ito arrived at the music room to find Kenji sitting motionless at the piano, staring at his hands. What's wrong? Mr. Ito asked, concerned. I'm scared, Kenji said simply, of performing. Kenji nodded. What if people laugh? What if they think I'm stupid for trying? Mr. Ito pulled up his chair and sat down. They might laugh, he said honestly. Some people laugh when they see something they don't understand. But I'll tell you something I've learned in my 72 years. The opinion of people who laugh at someone trying their best isn't worth very much. But everyone will be watching. Yes, they will. And some will laugh and some will be confused. But there will also be people who really listen. People who hear what you're actually doing with this old piano. Those are the people who matter. Mr. Ito leaned forward. Can I tell you a secret? When I was young, I played piano in a small club. I was never very good, but I loved it. One night, I made so many mistakes that I wanted to run off the stage. But after, an old woman came up to me and said she could hear the love in every note, even the wrong ones. The compliment meant more to me than any perfect performance ever could have. Kenji looked up at him. Do you think anyone will hear it? The love, I mean. I already do, Mr. Ito said with a smile. Every day when I listen to you practice, I hear it. That evening, as Kenji packed up his notebook and prepared to go home, he felt something shift inside him. The fear was still there, sitting heavy in his stomach. But alongside it was something else, a quiet determination. He'd spent 2 weeks learning this piano's language, understanding its quirks and limitations. He'd poured hours into preparing something unique, whether people laughed or not. Whether they understood or not, he was going to play. He was going to show them what this broken piano could do. The morning of the festival arrived with clear autumn skies, and a crispness in the air that made everything feel fresh and full of possibility. Kenji woke up earlier than usual, his stomach tied in knots that made the thought of breakfast impossible. His mother noticed immediately. "You need to eat something," Yuki said, setting a bowl of rice and miso soup in front of him. "It's going to be a long day." Kenji managed a few bites, but the food felt like rocks in his throat. His father sat across from him, reading the morning paper, occasionally glancing up at his son with an expression that was hard to read. Finally, he folded the paper and set it aside. "Kenji," Takeshi said quietly, "no matter what happens today, your mother and I are proud of you. You worked hard for 2 weeks. That takes courage." Kenji nodded, not trusting himself to speak. His hands were already trembling slightly, and the performance was still hours away. By the time they arrived at Sakura Elementary, the school had been completely transformed. Colorful paper lanterns hung from trees. Food stalls lined the pathways selling takoyaki and yakisoba, and students in various costumes ran around excitedly. Parents walked in groups, cameras ready, chatting about which performances they were most looking forward to. The energy was infectious, and for a moment, Kenji felt a small spark of excitement break through his fear. The main performances were scheduled to take place in the gymnasium, where a proper stage had been set up. Kenji could see it through the open doors as they walked past. The beautiful grand piano sat prominently in the center, its polished black surface gleaming under the stage lights. Several students were already gathered around it, the advanced music students who would be performing proper pieces that everyone would admire. Kenji's mother squeezed his hand. "When is your performance?" "After lunch," he said quietly. "Around 1 o'clock. We'll be in the front row," she promised. The morning passed in a blur of activity. Kenji watched third graders perform a traditional dance, saw a comedy skit that made everyone laugh, and listened to the school choir sing folk songs. Everything was polished and well-rehearsed. The parents applauded enthusiastically, and the performers beamed with pride. During lunch, Kenji couldn't eat at all. He sat with his parents at one of the outdoor tables, watching them eat bento boxes while his own sat untouched. His mother tried to make conversation, pointing out decorations and commenting on earlier performances, but Kenji could barely focus on her words. Then he saw them. Hiroshi and his group of friends, standing near the gymnasium entrance talking with some of the festival organizers. They kept glancing in Kenji's direction and laughing. His stomach sank further. What Kenji didn't know was that there had been a problem. The festival committee had created a schedule weeks ago, and the broken piano had never been part of the plan. It wasn't even supposed to be at the gymnasium. When the organizers had reviewed the performance list that morning, they'd been confused by Kenji's name and the note that said piano performance, special instrument required. Mrs. Yamamoto, the music teacher, had been puzzled. "I never approved this," she said, scanning her records. "All the piano slots are for the grand piano, and they're all filled by my advanced students." That's when Hiroshi stepped forward with his friends, wearing expressions of false helpfulness. "Oh, that's Kenji Tanaka from 3rd grade," he explained smoothly. "He specifically requested the old piano from the music room. He's been practicing on it for weeks. We helped him sign up," Mrs. Yamamoto frowned. "The old upright? But that piano is broken. Surely he doesn't mean to actually perform on it." "He does," one of Hiroshi's friends confirmed, struggling to keep a straight face. He was very insistent about it. The teachers exchanged uncertain glances. They should have questioned this more, should have asked Kenji directly what was going on. But the festival was already running. They were busy coordinating dozens of performances, and they made a quick decision. If the boy wanted to use the old piano, they would accommodate him. "All right," Mrs. Yamamoto sighed. "Can you boys help bring it down from the music room?" "Of course," Hiroshi said, grinning widely. "We'd be happy to help." So while Kenji sat with his parents trying to calm his nerves, Hiroshi and his friends were upstairs, wheeling the old broken piano through the hallways on a creaky dolly. They were practically bursting with suppressed laughter, imagining the look on everyone's faces when this disaster of an instrument appeared on stage. By the time they got it to the gymnasium, word had already started to spread among the students. The quiet kid from 3rd grade was going to perform on the broken piano. The weird one who never talked to anyone was actually going to get up on stage and embarrass himself in front of the entire school. Some students felt sorry for him. A few of Kenji's classmates whispered among themselves, wondering if they should warn him, if they should tell a teacher that something wasn't right. But they were only 8 years old themselves, and the adult world of festival organizing and performance schedules felt too big and complicated to challenge. At 12:45, a teacher found Kenji and told him he was up next after the current performance finished. His mother saw the color drain from his face. "Are you all right?" Yuki asked, gripping his shoulders. "Kenji, if you don't want to do this, you don't have to. We can just leave right now." For a moment, Kenji seriously considered it, just standing up, walking out of the school and never thinking about this again. But then he thought about the past 2 weeks. All those hours in the music room, learning every quirk of that piano, having conversations with it through his playing. He thought about Mr. Ito's kind words and the melodies that lived in his head. "I want to do it," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. His father stood up and placed a hand on his son's thin shoulder. "Then we'll be right there watching. Remember, you're not performing for everyone else. You're performing because you love music. Focus on that." The gymnasium was packed when Kenji walked in. Students sat on the floor in rows. Parents filled the chairs at the back and teachers stood along the sides. The current performance was just ending, a group of 5th graders finishing a perfectly synchronized jump rope routine. The audience clapped enthusiastically. Then the stage crew began moving the grand piano to the side, and onto the stage they wheeled the old broken piano. A confused murmur rippled through the crowd. Parents turned to each other with questioning looks. Students began whispering and some started giggling. The contrast was stark. Next to the gleaming grand piano, the old upright looked sad and worn, its faded wood and yellowed keys like a poor relative at a fancy party. Hiroshi sat with his friends in the middle section, their faces bright with anticipation. This was going to be even better than they'd imagined. The whole school was here to watch. Mrs. Yamamoto stepped up to the microphone, looking slightly uncomfortable. "Our next performer is Kenji Tanaka from 3rd grade, who will be playing piano for us." The applause was polite but scattered. Most people were still staring at the broken piano, trying to understand what was happening. Kenji stood up from where he'd been sitting with his parents. His legs felt weak, and his hands were ice cold despite the warmth of the gymnasium. The walk from his seat to the stage felt impossibly long. Every step carried him closer to either triumph or complete humiliation, and he had no idea which it would be. He was aware of eyes on him from all directions. He could hear whispers, could see some students pointing and laughing behind their hands. His mother's face in the front row was tight with worry, and his father sat rigid, hands clenched in his lap. Kenji climbed the steps to the stage. The wood creaked under his feet, and the sound seemed impossibly loud in his ears. He crossed to the piano, that familiar old instrument that he'd spent 2 weeks getting to know. Under the bright stage lights, it looked even more worn and tired than usual. He sat down on the bench, and it creaked just like it always did. The gymnasium had gone quieter now, but it wasn't a respectful quiet. It was the quiet of people waiting for something to go wrong, the quiet before laughter. Kenji could see everything from up here. The students in their rows, some already smirking. The parents looking confused. The teachers with concerned expressions. Hiroshi and his friends were easy to spot, practically vibrating with suppressed laughter. He placed his hands on the keys, feeling the familiar cool smoothness under his fingers. He could feel the slight stickiness of the E-flat key, knew exactly which keys would resist and which would barely make sound. This piano had become a friend over the past 2 weeks, and now he was going to show everyone what his friend could do. Kenji closed his eyes and took one deep breath. The gymnasium held its breath with him, waiting. And then finally he began to play. The first notes that came from the broken piano were soft, almost hesitant, like someone testing the water before diving in. Kenji's fingers touched the keys with a gentleness that surprised everyone who was paying attention. He started with a simple melody, something that sounded vaguely familiar but wasn't quite anything anyone could name. In the audience, a few students giggled. They were waiting for the disaster, for the stuck keys and the missing notes that would confirm this was all a big joke. Hiroshi leaned forward in his seat, a grin already spreading across his face. But then something unexpected happened. When Kenji reached the first key that didn't work properly, the E-flat that always stuck, he didn't fight against it. Instead, he pressed it down and held it, letting the delay become a pause in the music. It created a moment of suspension, a breath before the melody continued. It wasn't a mistake. It was intentional. The giggles started to fade. Kenji moved into a more complex phrase, his fingers dancing across the keys with a confidence that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside him. When he came to the section where 3 keys produced almost no sound, he played them anyway. But he'd arranged the music so that their near silence created a ghostly echo effect, like a memory of notes rather than the notes themselves. It was hauntingly beautiful. In the front row, Yuki's hands flew to her mouth. She'd been prepared for embarrassment, had been ready to rush the stage and pull her son away if people started laughing too loudly. But this was something she'd never imagined. Her quiet son, who she thought had never touched a piano, was creating music. Kenji's body began to sway slightly as he played, lost in the world of sound he was creating. His eyes were closed now, and his face had a peaceful expression that his mother had never seen before. He looked like he'd finally found the place where he belonged. The melody shifted, incorporating what sounded like fragments of classical pieces. There was a bit of Mozart in there, some Beethoven, strains of traditional Japanese folk songs, all woven together into something entirely new. It shouldn't have worked. The piano was broken, the keys were unreliable, the tuning was wrong. But somehow Kenji had turned all of those flaws into features. When a key stuck, the pause became part of the rhythm. When notes sounded off-key, they added a melancholic quality that made the music more emotional, not less. The 2 keys that produced no sound at all became rests that gave the melody room to breathe. He was playing the piano not as it should be, but as it was, and in doing so, he was creating something completely unique. Mr. Ito stood in the back of the gymnasium, tears streaming down his weathered face. He'd listened to Kenji practice for 2 weeks, but this was different. Under the pressure of performance in front of hundreds of people, the boy had found something extra, some deeper well of emotion to draw from. The old janitor thought about his own youth, about the music he'd once played, and he felt a mixture of joy and bittersweet nostalgia that made his chest ache. The audience had gone completely silent now. Not the expectant silence from before, but a reverent quiet, the kind that falls when people witness something they don't fully understand, but know is special. Parents who had been checking their phones put them away. Students who had been whispering to friends sat still, transfixed. Even the teachers along the walls had stopped their quiet coordination and were simply listening. Hiroshi's grin had vanished. He sat frozen in his seat, his mouth slightly open, staring at the stage in disbelief. This wasn't what was supposed to happen. The quiet kid was supposed to fail, to confirm everything Hiroshi and his friends had assumed about him. But instead, Kenji was doing something that none of them could do. Creating beauty from brokenness. Kenji moved into the final section of his performance, his fingers flowing across the keys with increasing confidence. The melody built to a gentle climax, not loud or showy, but emotionally powerful. He used every trick he'd learned over the past 2 weeks, every technique he'd developed for working with the piano's quirks. The sticky keys created syncopated rhythms. The quiet keys added texture. The off-tune notes gave the music a raw, honest quality. And then, with one final gentle chord that incorporated both working keys and broken ones, he finished. For 3 full seconds, the gymnasium was absolutely silent. Kenji sat at the piano, his hands still resting on the keys, his eyes still closed. He wasn't sure what was happening, couldn't bring himself to open his eyes and face whatever reaction awaited him. Then someone started clapping. It was Mr. Ito in the back, his weathered hands coming together in enthusiastic applause. Within a heartbeat, Kenji's father joined in, standing up from his seat. Then his mother, tears streaming down her face. Then a parent in the 3rd row who had actually been listening, really listening. The applause spread like ripples in a pond, growing louder and more widespread with each passing second. Students who'd been ready to laugh found themselves clapping instead. not entirely sure why, but feeling like they'd witnessed something important. Teachers applauded, their faces showing surprise and respect. Within seconds, the entire gymnasium was filled with the sound of clapping hands. And then people began to stand. First the parents, then the teachers, then even some of the students. A standing ovation, building and building until the gymnasium thundered with applause. Kenji finally opened his eyes. He turned on the bench, looking out at the sea of standing, clapping people, and his face showed pure shock. This wasn't what he'd expected. He'd hoped not to be laughed at, had hoped maybe a few people would appreciate what he was trying to do. But this was beyond anything he'd imagined. His mother was crying openly now, her hands clasped together as if in prayer. His father stood tall beside her, his usually stern face softened with pride and wonder. In the back, Mr. Ito was wiping his eyes with a handkerchief, still clapping enthusiastically. Mrs. Yamamoto, the music teacher, made her way to the stage with an expression of amazement. She'd taught music for 15 years, and had never seen anything quite like what had just happened. As Kenji stood up from the bench, she bent down to his level. "That was extraordinary," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "How long have you been taking lessons?" "I haven't," Kenji said softly. "I taught myself." Mrs. Yamamoto straightened up, her hand over her heart. She turned to the audience and took the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, what we just witnessed was a completely self-taught performance. Kenji has never had a single piano lesson." The applause somehow grew even louder. Parents looked at each other in disbelief. How was it possible? How could a child teach himself to play like that? But those who'd really been listening understood it wasn't just about the playing. It was about the creativity, the problem-solving, the ability to see possibility where others saw only limitation. Kenji hadn't just learned to play a broken piano. He'd learned to see its brokenness as a gift, as something that made his music unique rather than impossible. As Kenji walked off the stage, still in a daze, people reached out to pat his shoulder, to offer congratulations. His classmates, the same ones who'd ignored him for years, looked at him with new eyes. He wasn't just the quiet kid anymore. He was the boy who'd done something amazing. His parents met him at the bottom of the stage steps, and his mother pulled him into a tight hug. "Why didn't you tell us?" she whispered. "Why didn't you tell us you could do this?" "I didn't know if I could," Kenji admitted. "Not until I tried." The rest of the festival passed in a blur. People kept approaching the Tanaka family, asking questions, offering compliments. A woman introduced herself as a music teacher from a prestigious conservatory in Tokyo. She'd been visiting the festival because her niece was performing. But Kenji's performance had caught her attention. "I'd like to offer Kenji a scholarship," she said to his stunned parents. "We have a program for gifted students, and what I saw today was remarkable. With proper training, he could become truly exceptional." Takeshi and Yuki could hardly speak. A scholarship? To a prestigious school? For their son who'd never had a single lesson? It felt like a dream. But more important than the scholarship, more important than the applause or the recognition, was something else that had changed. As the day wound down and families began to leave, Kenji noticed something different. Students were talking to him, asking him questions, treating him like someone worth knowing. A girl from his class approached shyly. "That was really cool, Kenji. I never knew you liked music." "I do," he said, and for the first time in his life at school, he smiled openly. "I love it.